About 40% of the imported shrimp to the United States come from India. Now, the EU, Japan, and the US finds illegal antibiotics in their shipments. And there's also allegations that they use forced labor at every step of the supply chain. If we have tariffs as a tool, and we can show, my gosh, there's phytosanitary issues, there is forced labor issues, and yet we are having our people driven out of business by shrimp being dumped into our country, would you commit to putting a slap on a tariff on the shrimp if we can show that it's being imported under those circumstances?
Well, Senator, if there's a process, and Section 301 and other statutes have a process behind them, if I prejudge them, I get in trouble in the courts, right? But if we have an investigation and it shows there are unfair trading practices, you can certainly impose a tariff or other measures if that trade practice isn't remedied. And I think it's really important to work with you and the shrimpers, because if they feel like they're not getting the relief they need from trade remedies or other venues, then we need to explore whether it's Section 301 or other tools to make sure that we're detecting the unfairnesses and addressing them.
You have been concerned, expressed skepticism about the need for binding dispute mechanisms at the WTO. But my rice producers and others have won decisions at the WTO on commitments by other countries on agricultural subsidies, and yet they're not enforced. And so are my agricultural people just out in the cold? There are disputes that they win, but they now don't even have a dispute. And if they get the dispute, it's not enforced. You see, help my rice producer here. How are we going to handle that?
No, Senator, I think you're exactly right. And that's part of the reason why I show skepticism sometimes about the WTO, because we win a case, we get a result, and then it's not fixed, or it's fixed on the surface in some other.
Now, there's two different issues, though. One, you got to win the case, and then you got to enforce it. Exactly. But the first step is winning the case, and that I say there's been some progress in. It's the lack of enforcement, which is critical. But that doesn't necessarily throw out winning the case, if you follow what I'm saying.
Certainly. I mean, listen, if you're trying to get rid of a trade barrier, there are a few ways to do it, right? You can try to negotiate it, which is on its face not always successful if you don't have the leverage behind it. If you have a case, you have some legitimate authority to go to them and say to change it. We also have domestic laws like Section 301 and others that can identify and detect unfair trading practices.
Now, those are 301 and all those are kind of like economic necessity. Are you saying that we would use other mechanisms, we would abandon, if you will, WTO IDR, to use a bunch of abbreviations, and rely upon existing laws domestically to provide a tariff relief?
So I think we need to use any tools we have available to get relief so we can have the market access.
So I guess my question is, why would we be tossing a tool out? If we want any tool, but we're tossing out the tool of the IDR, even if there's been faulty commitment, it seems to me like we're taking a tool and we're getting rid of it when we just said we want any tool that we can.
Well, Senator, I think part of the problems we've had with the WTO, and this has been bipartisan. I've seen letters from the chairman and the ranking member talking about how we need to make sure that the WTO doesn't undermine our trade rights and our trade laws. Listen, if we can use the WTO effectively to negotiate rules or to get a good panel result, that's fine. But we need to your point, we have to have enforcement. And at the end of the day, what that means is USTR has to go to the country and enforce the law. And sometimes that means imposing tariffs on them. When we say trade enforcement, that means tariffs.
Okay, so that's my next question. You're setting it up beautifully. About 40% of the imported shrimp to the United States come from India. Now, the EU, Japan, and the US finds illegal antibiotics in their shipments. And there's also allegations that they use forced labor at every step of the supply chain. I think I've raised this with your former boss, with Catherine Tai, and now with you. If we have tariffs as a tool, and we can show, my gosh, there's phytosanitary issues, there is forced labor issues, and yet we are having our people driven out of business by shrimp being dumped into our country, would you commit to putting a slap and a tariff on the shrimp if we can show that it's being imported under those circumstances?
Well, Senator, if there's a process, and Section 301 and other statutes have a process behind them. If I prejudge them, I get in trouble in the courts, right? But if we have an investigation and it shows there are unfair trading practices, you can certainly impose a tariff or other measures if that trade practice isn't remedied. And I think it's really important to work with you and the shrimpers, because if they feel like they're not getting the relief they need from trade remedies or other venues, then we need to explore whether it's Section 301 or other tools to make sure that we're detecting the unfairnesses and addressing it.
Sounds great. Let me echo something I think Sheldon Whitehouse brought up, and we spoke about it when we met. Right now, I'm not against tariffs. I think just kind of across the board tariff for tariff's sake, I'm not quite so sure about. And I'm not quite sure of exactly how the law is being applied. But one thing I am concerned about is that China is not enforcing environmental regulations. They produce a lot of sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, you name it, in the atmosphere, blows in the trade winds over into our country, but it lowers their cost of manufacturing by not enforcing those environmental regulations by 20%, and our industry moves there because they've just lowered their manufacturing cost by 20% by dumping their air pollution on us. Now, this classical economics, you would tax the externality, and I have proposed a fee on the carbon-intense product from countries which do not enforce internationally accepted norms on pollution control. Any thoughts upon that?
Well, I think you've articulated the problem statement very well. I think there's an unlevel playing field, and I think that other countries take advantage of total lack of environmental regulations. And we'll differ, obviously, in our country on the appropriate level of environmental regulations, but we're cleaner than these other places in the way we manufacture. And I think it would be interesting to explore with you and the rest of the committee, how do we actually address that issue? And I think we do have to think of creative notions on how to do it.
I take that as your commitment to support the foreign pollution fee. Thank you very much.
Mr. Greer, during the last administration, trade policy seemed to be treated as an abstract concept. Not really an opportunity for America to gain market share, to make our people wealthier. If anything, trade policy was something that where we were consistently in a defensive crouch. It screamed insecurity. It screamed weakness, and I'm certainly expecting better from this muscular administration as it relates to trade policy. Ignoring trade doesn't make us stronger. It cedes ground. It cedes ground when we are actively looking for partners and allies to help us shore up our supply chain by building redundancies. It cedes all sorts of economic ground. I've introduced a Strategic Minerals Act. We introduced it yesterday that would give this president and future presidents more authority when it comes to renegotiating sector-specific free trade agreements, focused exclusively, in this case, on critical minerals and rare earth elements. We need these. We don't have them in the ground here. So we need to trade in order to get access to them. My legislation is designed to bolster cooperation. We're looking for vectors of cooperation with friends and allies, to eliminate barriers, to enhance our nation's economic security so we're not starved of essentials as we were recently during the pandemic. Mr. Greer, you've expressed support for sectoral trade agreements in the past. If confirmed, which countries and sectors do you see as the most viable for securing market-opening trade deals that will uplift American businesses and workers? And how will you ensure that the United States is no longer shut out of critical supply chains?
Senator, I appreciate your views on this and the conversation we had in your office. I'll note at the top that the president's trade policy memorandum that he set out 2 weeks ago, one of the things he talked about was considering whether bilateral or sectoral agreements might make sense in some areas. And I spoke earlier with Senator Johnson about some of the key supply chains that I worry about, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, critical minerals, rare earth. I think those all fall into that.
Yes.
I want to be very careful when we're talking about trade agreements because I don't want to be in the position of going to a country that has a $50 billion trade surplus already, and they want us to pull down our tariffs on trucks and cars for them. Like that to me is not the kind of trade I want.
Understood.
But if there is a sectoral agreement with like-minded countries who are aligned with us on, security, rule of law, things
Yes.
like that, those are the kinds of places where I think we should focus.